In the year 1252, behind the stone walls of papal authority, a document was signed that would unleash centuries of calculated suffering. Pope Innocent IV's papal bull Ad Extirpanda didn't just authorize torture, it perfected it. What emerged was a method so ingeniously cruel that it could break the human body without spilling a single drop of blood, adhering to the Church's own canon law while devastating its victims both physically and psychologically. This was the Strappado, and its story reveals how institutional power can transform religious doctrine into instruments of terror. The Catholic Church of the 13th century stood at the apex of European power, wielding influence that extended far beyond spiritual matters into the very fabric of daily life. As heretical movements like the Cathars and Waldensians challenged papal authority, the Church faced an existential crisis that demanded unprecedented measures. The Inquisition, established to root out heresy, required methods of interrogation that could extract confessions while maintaining the Church's moral facade. Canon law strictly forbade the shedding of blood during interrogation, creating a theological puzzle that inquisitors would solve with horrifying creativity. The solution came in the form of rope and gravity, simple tools that could inflict unimaginable agony without breaking the Church's prohibition against bloodshed. The Strappado, also known as the Strappado or rope torture, became the cornerstone of inquisitorial interrogation. Victims would have their hands bound tightly behind their backs with coarse hemp rope, their wrists often swelling and turning purple within minutes as circulation was cut off. The rope would then be threaded through a pulley system mounted high on the chamber ceiling, transforming the interrogation room into a theater of calculated suffering. When the rope was pulled, victims would be hoisted slowly into the air, their entire body weight suspended by their unnaturally positioned arms. The shoulders, forced into an impossible angle, would begin to separate almost immediately. The sound, a wet, grinding pop as joints dislocated, became as much a part of the interrogation as the questions themselves. Victims would hang there, sometimes for hours, their arms twisted behind them at angles that the human body was never meant to endure, while inquisitors calmly questioned them about their faith, their associations, their thoughts. But the Church's cruelty didn't end with simple suspension. Inquisitors discovered that the true power of the Strappado lay in its variations, each more devastating than the last. Stone weights, carefully calibrated according to the victim's social status and perceived guilt, would be attached to the ankles. Peasants might bear 50 pounds, while nobility could face twice that amount. These weights didn't just increase the pain. They transformed the torture into a systematic destruction of the human spine. Vertebrae would separate under the stress, creating internal injuries that might never fully heal, ensuring that even survivors would carry the Church's mark for the rest of their lives. The psychological impact proved even more devastating than the physical trauma. Victims would be subjected to what inquisitors called territorial interrogation. They would be lifted and dropped repeatedly, their bodies jerking violently as the rope caught their fall just before their feet touched the ground. This technique, known as the shake of the rope, would send shockwaves through already damaged joints and create a psychological anticipation of relief that never came. Many victims, hanging in agony, would watch as the torturer's assistants prepared additional weights, knowing that their suffering had only just begun. The Church's records, meticulously maintained despite their damning content, reveal the calculated nature of these sessions. Interrogations were scheduled like church services, with specific times allocated for different phases of torture. Morning sessions typically began with simple suspension, allowing the victim to contemplate their sins while their shoulders slowly separated. Afternoon sessions would introduce weights, and evening sessions, reserved for the most stubborn heretics, would incorporate the territorial interrogation techniques that often left victims unconscious or permanently disabled. What emerges from these records is not random cruelty, but systematic psychological warfare. The strappado was designed not just to extract confessions, but to create a specific type of psychological break. Victims would experience what modern psychology recognizes as learned helplessness, a state where the individual becomes convinced that their suffering is both inevitable and entirely dependent on the will of their captors. This psychological conditioning extended far beyond the torture chamber, creating communities where the mere mention of heretical thoughts could trigger paralyzing fear. The Church's sophistication in applying the strappado revealed itself in the careful attention paid to each victim's social status and perceived importance. Nobles and wealthy merchants would often receive merciful treatment, shorter sessions with lighter weights, ensuring they could return to society as walking advertisements for papal power while remaining functional enough to manage their estates and continue paying church taxes. Peasants and suspected heretics, however, faced the full brutality of the method, often emerging as broken warnings to their communities about the consequences of challenging church authority. The escalation patterns documented in inquisitorial records show how the strappado was systematically refined over decades of use. Early sessions typically lasted 30 minutes to an hour, but as inquisitors gained experience, they discovered that shorter, more intense sessions, followed by brief periods of relief, could be far more effective at breaking psychological resistance. This technique, which they called the rhythm of revelation, would see victims hoisted and lowered multiple times within a single session, each cycle increasing in intensity and duration. The weights themselves became tools of precise psychological manipulation. Rather than immediately applying the heaviest possible load, inquisitors would begin with lighter weights and gradually increase them throughout the session. Victims would be forced to watch as each new stone was selected and attached, the anticipation of increased agony often proving as effective as the torture itself. The Church's records describe how some victims would begin confessing as soon as they saw the weights being prepared, their minds unable to endure the prospect of escalated suffering. Perhaps most revealing was the Church's development of what they termed testimonial torture, sessions where suspected heretics would be forced to watch others being subjected to the strappado before their own interrogation began. These preliminary sessions served multiple purposes. They demonstrated the futility of resistance, provided detailed information about what the victim could expect, and created a psychological state where the actual torture often seemed almost merciful by comparison. The Church had discovered that the human imagination, when properly primed with vivid examples, could be its own instrument of torture. The physical mechanics of the strappado were refined through centuries of experimentation on human subjects. Church records detail how the angle of suspension could be adjusted to target different joints and muscles, how the speed of hoisting could be varied to maximize shock and disorientation, and how environmental factors like temperature and humidity could be manipulated to increase suffering. Winter sessions were particularly brutal, as the cold would cause muscles to tighten and joints to stiffen, making even minor movements excruciating. The rope itself became an object of careful consideration. Different materials were tested for their psychological and physical impact. Hemp rope, with its rough texture, would leave permanent scarring on wrists and create additional pain as it tightened under the victim's weight. Silk rope, occasionally used for nobility, caused less external damage, but proved equally effective at joint dislocation. The Church eventually standardized on hemp for its practical and symbolic properties. It was both economical and served as a constant reminder of the victim's low status in the eyes of their interrogators. Recovery periods between torture sessions were calculated with the same precision as the torture itself. Inquisitors discovered that allowing victims to partially heal between sessions created a psychological dynamic where hope would alternate with despair, making the eventual breakdown more complete. Medical knowledge, limited though it was in the medieval period, was applied to ensure that victims could survive multiple sessions while experiencing maximum suffering. Church physicians would examine victims to determine their capacity to endure additional torture, treating their medical knowledge as a tool for prolonging rather than alleviating suffering. The documentation of these sessions reveals the bureaucratic nature of the torture process. Each session was recorded with the same attention to detail as any other church administrative function. The time of day, weather conditions, victims' responses, and physical condition were all meticulously noted. These records served both legal and practical purposes. They provided evidence of proper procedure for church authorities while creating a database of techniques and their effectiveness for future reference. It was within this system of calculated cruelty that the extraordinary story of Apollonia of Alexandria began to unfold. Born into a Christian family in Egypt during the reign of Emperor Decius, Apollonia lived in an era when faith itself was a capital offense. The Roman persecution of Christians had reached new heights of brutality, and those suspected of following the radical teachings of Christ faced torture and execution. What made Apollonia's case unique was not just her faith, but her complete refusal to renounce it, despite enduring what historians now recognize as one of the most prolonged and systematic torture campaigns in recorded history. Apollonia was first arrested in 249 CE during a coordinated sweep of Christian communities in Alexandria. Roman authorities, working with local collaborators, had developed sophisticated methods for identifying Christians, including the use of informants within Christian communities and elaborate traps designed to reveal religious affiliation. Apollonia was betrayed by a neighbor who had observed her participating in what appeared to be Christian rituals, though the exact nature of these activities remains unclear from surviving records. The initial interrogation followed standard Roman procedure for dealing with suspected Christians. Apollonia was brought before a Roman magistrate and given the opportunity to renounce her faith by offering sacrifice to the Roman gods. This was considered a merciful approach. The Romans generally preferred to convert rather than execute suspected Christians, seeing conversion as more beneficial to imperial stability than martyrdom. Apollonia's refusal to participate in the sacrifice ritual immediately escalated her case to the level of formal torture proceedings. Roman torture methods of the period were designed to be both physically devastating and psychologically overwhelming. The Romans had perfected techniques that could inflict maximum suffering while keeping victims conscious and capable of response. For Christians, who often viewed martyrdom as a pathway to salvation, this created a particular challenge for Roman authorities. They needed to find ways to break down religious conviction while avoiding the creation of martyrs who might inspire further resistance. The torture of Apollonia began with traditional Roman methods: beating, burning, and the application of various instruments designed to cause pain without immediately killing the victim. What made her case extraordinary was her complete silence during these initial sessions. Roman records, discovered centuries later in church archives, describe how Apollonia would neither scream nor speak during torture, maintaining what her torturers described as an unnatural composure that frustrated their efforts to extract information about other Christians. As the torture sessions continued without success, Roman authorities decided to escalate their methods. This is where the early version of what would later become the strappado was first documented. While not identical to the refined technique later developed by the Inquisition, the basic principle was the same: suspension by the arms to create joint dislocation and overwhelming pain. The Romans attached Apollonia to a wooden frame with her arms pulled behind her back, then slowly raised the frame until her feet left the ground. The documentation of Apollonia's torture sessions provides crucial insight into the development of systematic torture techniques. Each session was recorded by Roman scribes, who noted not only the methods used, but also the victim's responses, physical condition, and apparent psychological state. These records, preserved because of their administrative importance, would later influence the development of medieval torture techniques when they were discovered in monastic libraries during the early days of the Inquisition. What emerged from these records was evidence of Apollonia's extraordinary resistance to torture. Session after session, she maintained her silence and refused to provide information about other Christians or renounce her faith. More remarkably, she seemed to recover from injuries that should have been permanently disabling. Roman physicians called in to examine her between sessions reported healing that they described as contrary to natural law, though they attributed this to unknown medical factors rather than divine intervention. The psychological impact of Apollonia's resistance on her torturers became a significant factor in her case. Roman records describe growing frustration among the interrogation team as traditional methods proved ineffective. This frustration led to the development of new techniques specifically designed to break what they perceived as Apollonia's supernatural resistance. Weights were added to the suspension torture, creating the prototype for what would later become the refined strappado of the medieval period. By the 14th torture session, Roman authorities faced a crisis. Apollonia had survived treatment that had killed other prisoners, maintained her silence despite techniques that typically produced confessions within hours, and showed signs of physical recovery that their physicians could not explain. More troubling from the Roman perspective was the effect her resistance was having on other prisoners and even on some of the guards and torturers themselves. Reports began to surface of conversations among prison staff about the possibility that Apollonia possessed divine protection. The final session was designed to be definitively fatal. Roman authorities, unable to break Apollonia through torture, decided to execute her in a manner that would serve as a warning to other Christians, while eliminating what had become a source of embarrassment and growing superstition among their own personnel. The execution was planned as a public burning, with Apollonia to be tied to a stake and burned alive in the center of Alexandria as a demonstration of Roman power over Christian resistance. However, according to multiple historical sources, including Roman administrative records and early Christian writings, the execution did not proceed as planned. As the fire was being lit around the stake, Apollonia reportedly broke free from her restraints and threw herself into the flames, choosing the timing and manner of her death rather than allowing the Romans to control it. This act of final defiance transformed what was intended as a demonstration of Roman power into a symbol of Christian resistance and divine favor. The immediate aftermath of Apollonia's death created significant problems for Roman authorities in Alexandria. Rather than serving as a deterrent to Christian activity, her execution became a rallying point for Christian communities throughout the region. Stories of her supernatural resistance to torture and her final act of defiance spread rapidly, inspiring other Christians to acts of resistance and creating what Roman governors described as an epidemic of Christian boldness that threatened public order. The Roman documentation of Apollonia's case was preserved because of its administrative importance, but it was later discovered by medieval church scholars who saw in it both inspiration and practical information. The torture techniques described in Roman records provided a foundation for the development of more sophisticated methods during the Inquisition period. Church authorities noted particularly the effectiveness of suspension torture and the psychological impact of prolonged, systematic sessions. When Pope Innocent IV authorized the use of torture in 1252, the techniques developed for Apollonia's interrogation were among the methods studied and refined. The Church saw in her case not just a story of Christian martyrdom, but a practical guide to the limits and potential of systematic torture. The fact that even 14 sessions had failed to break her resistance was seen as a challenge to be overcome through better technique and more sophisticated understanding of human psychology. The medieval church's adoption of the strappado was directly influenced by the Roman documentation of Apollonia's torture. Church scholars noted that the suspension technique had come closest to breaking her resistance and theorized that the Roman failure was due to insufficient understanding of the psychological aspects of torture. The Inquisition's refinement of